My only daughter looked me dead in the eye on her wedding day and told me I was a stain on her perfect life. She stood in her stunning white gown, blocked the entrance to the grand ballroom, and told me to leave before I humiliated her in front of her new wealthy family. I did not yell. I did not beg. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked out into the cold Chicago rain. But she forgot one very crucial detail about the man she had just kicked out into the street. I was the one holding the contract for the entire event. Exactly 1 hour later, the orchestra stopped playing. The crystal chandeliers were turned on to maximum brightness, and 200 of her elite guests were escorted out of the hotel by security. If you want to know how a father's unconditional love turned into the most ruthless business decision of his life, take a deep breath. Because the betrayal I experienced that day was just the tip of a very dark, very dangerous iceberg. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button if you believe that respect must be earned even by family. My name is Victor Thorne. I am 70 years old. I was standing outside the majestic double doors of the Waldorf Astoria in Chicago, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that felt completely alien on my shoulders. In my right hand, I held a small, heavy velvet box containing a vintage diamond necklace that had once belonged to my late wife, Caroline. It was supposed to be my wedding gift to our only daughter, Morgan. I had written a check for $150,000 to pay for this exact night. Every silk napkin, every crystal goblet, every orchid inside that ballroom was paid for by the sweat of my brow. But as I stepped onto the plush red carpet leading to the grand entrance, a large security guard in a dark suit stepped in front of me, putting a firm hand on my chest. I smiled, thinking it was a simple misunderstanding. I gave him my name, expecting him to step aside and apologize. Instead, he pulled out a leather-bound guest list, ran his finger down the pages, and shook his head. He told me with cold professionalism that my name was not on the list. I laughed. I told him I was the father of the bride. I told him I was the one who funded the entire reception. He did not care. He crossed his arms and told me that if I did not step back, he would have me removed from the premises. Before I could demand to speak to the manager, the heavy oak doors opened. Morgan rushed out. She looked breathtaking in her bridal gown, a vision of elegance and grace. My heart swelled for a fraction of a second. I expected her to scold the guard, to throw her arms around my neck, and apologize for the mix-up. But she did not reach for me. She did not smile. She grabbed my arm with a grip so tight, her manicured nails dug into my sleeve, and she dragged me away from the entrance, pulling me into a dimly lit service hallway where no one could see us. I looked at her face, searching for the loving daughter I had raised, but her eyes were completely empty. They were cold, calculating, and filled with an intense, burning irritation. I asked her what was going on. I held up the velvet box, trying to show her the necklace. She slapped my hand down. Then she delivered the words that shattered my reality. She looked around nervously and whispered that I needed to leave immediately. She said that Preston, her groom, came from a family of ultra-conservative political elites. She told me that his parents, his uncles, and his wealthy associates were all inside, and they were judging every single detail of this wedding. She looked at my hands, rough, scarred, and permanently calloused from 40 years of hauling bricks, pouring concrete, and building a construction empire from the dirt up. She told me that my loud voice, my lack of refined etiquette, and my rough blue-collar background were simply bad for optics. She said she could not afford to have her new family look down on her because of where she came from. She promised she would make it up to me tomorrow with a private dinner, but for tonight I was a liability. She told me to go away. I stood there, in the flickering light of the service corridor, the air knocked completely out of my lungs. I did not give her a long speech about my sacrifices. I did not scream about the past. But in my mind, the memories flashed violently. I remembered the freezing Chicago winters when I worked double shifts at the lumber yard, my hands bleeding and cracking in the cold, just to pay for her elite private school tuition. I remembered the day her mother, Caroline, died of breast cancer when Morgan was just 12 years old. I had promised Caroline on her deathbed that our daughter would never want for anything, that she would have the life we never had. I built Thorn Construction from a single rusted pickup truck into a massive regional enterprise, pouring every ounce of my soul, my time, and my health into concrete and steel solely to elevate her. I bought her the imported cars, paid for the Ivy League degree, and handed her a life wrapped in gold. And now, the very hands that had bled to build her throne were considered too ugly, too unrefined to sit at her table. She was embarrassed by the exact sacrifices that had paid for the dress she was wearing. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly backed out of the service hallway and walked toward the grand glass windows that separated the foyer from the main ballroom. Through the thick glass, I saw the man she was marrying. Preston Gaines. He was standing near a towering champagne pyramid surrounded by his wealthy, arrogant family. I watched him raise his glass. As he lifted his arm, the heavy diamond-encrusted Rolex gleaming on his wrist caught the light. It was a $30,000 watch. I had purchased it specifically for him as an engagement gift, a gesture of welcome into our family. Preston lowered his glass and looked past his friends. His eyes met mine through the glass window. He did not look surprised. He did not look apologetic. He looked at me, checked the expensive watch I had bought him, and then he smirked. It was a slow, deliberate, contemptuous smile. The absolute arrogance of a man who thought he had just successfully discarded a useless, clueless old fool. In that exact fraction of a second, the crushing grief in my chest evaporated. It vanished completely, burned away by something much colder and much sharper. The heartbroken father died right there on the carpet of the Waldorf Astoria, and the ruthless, calculating businessman who had survived 40 years of cutthroat corporate warfare woke up. I nodded at Preston. I turned my back to the ballroom, walked out into the pouring rain, and pulled out my cell phone. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the heavy Chicago rain pounding against the windshield like a barrage of relentless fists trying to break through the glass. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the grand entrance of the Waldorf Astoria, leaving behind the glittering lights, the valet attendants, and the daughter who had just discarded me like a piece of broken machinery. I drove without a destination, letting the rhythmic, hypnotic thud of the windshield wipers match the racing beat of my heart. The crushing grief that had paralyzed me in that service hallway was entirely gone now. In its place, a pristine, razor-sharp clarity began to take over my mind. Every instinct I had honed over 4 decades of surviving in the cutthroat commercial construction industry was screaming at me, forcing me to analyze what had just happened. I kept seeing Preston Gaines looking at me through that thick glass. I kept replaying the way he checked the $30,000 Rolex I had bought him, and the way his lips had curled into that sickening smirk. That was not just the snobbery of a trust fund child looking down on a man who had earned his calluses. I knew men like Preston. I had dealt with them in boardrooms and on negotiation tables. That specific smile was the absolute, unadulterated arrogance of a thief who firmly believes he has already gotten away with the heist. He looked at me as if I were a defeated mark. My mind violently shifted gears, racing back to a quiet Tuesday afternoon in my corporate office exactly 1 month ago. The pieces of a very disturbing puzzle suddenly began to snap together with terrifying precision. Morgan had shown up unannounced, bringing me my favorite coffee and wearing a bright, loving smile. She had walked into my office carrying a thick stack of legal documents enclosed in a premium leather binder. She had smelled of the expensive French perfume I paid for, and her voice had been as smooth as silk. She sat across from my desk, leaned in close, and relentlessly pressured me to sign what she called a revolutionary tax optimization strategy. She spun a brilliant, complicated story about how Preston and his new tech startup financial team had discovered a massive legal loophole that could shield my construction empire from heavy federal taxes. She claimed it would save me millions of dollars, ensuring that her future and my legacy would be utterly bulletproof. I remembered the exact weight of the Mont Blanc pen in my hand. I remembered hesitating for a fraction of a second, suggesting that I should send the file over to my corporate attorney, Bradley Lawson, just for a standard review. But Morgan had reached across the mahogany desk, placing her soft hand over my rough, scarred knuckles. She had looked at me with those wide, innocent eyes and told me that Preston needed this signed today to lock in the corporate rates. She used my profound love for her as a weapon. She leveraged my lingering grief over her mother to completely lower my defenses. I had signed those papers without reading the fine print simply because I trusted my only child unconditionally. The memory of my pen scratching across those pages now felt like a knife dragging across my throat. Preston was not smirking because I was uninvited to a party. I was smirking because he thought he owned me. I refused to be a victim. I did not spend 40 years pouring concrete, breaking my back, and building a multi-million-dollar enterprise from the dirt up just to be swindled by a spoiled boy in a rented tuxedo and a daughter who had lost her soul. I slammed my foot on the brake pedal and pulled my car violently over to the side of the slick, rain-washed avenue. The tires screeched against the wet asphalt as I threw the transmission into park. I left the engine idling, the low hum vibrating through the floorboards. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, pulled out my cell phone, and immediately navigated to my contacts. I bypassed my lawyers, my accountants, and my security team. I went straight for the jugular of the immediate situation. I dialed the direct office line for Valerie Sutton, the executive banquet manager at the Waldorf Astoria. The line rang twice before she picked up. Her voice was cheerful, professional, and entirely oblivious to the storm brewing outside her doors. She greeted me warmly, thanking me again for choosing their venue, and mentioning how absolutely breathtaking the bride looked walking around the grand ballroom. I did not exchange pleasantries. I cut through her polite chatter with a voice so cold and authoritative that it immediately silenced her. I told her to listen to me very carefully. I reminded her that my name, Victor Thorne, was the only name printed on the master contract for this event. I reminded her that it was my personal platinum credit card that had processed the $50,000 deposit and my card that was currently on file to authorize the final $100,000 charge at the end of the night. She stammered, confirming that I was indeed the sole financial sponsor of the evening. I took a deep breath and delivered the command. I told Valerie to cut the music, clear the food, and close the open bar. I ordered her to cancel everything immediately. There was a stunned, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of the string quartet playing a classical piece in the background of her office. When Valerie finally found her voice, it was laced with sheer, unfiltered panic. She pleaded with me, her words tumbling over each other. She explained that the 200 guests were currently seated and actively eating their imported caviar appetizers. She said the champagne towers had just been filled, and the main course of filet mignon was currently being plated in the kitchen. She told me it was completely unprecedented to halt an active wedding reception of this magnitude and begged me to reconsider. I gripped the phone tighter, my voice dropping to a dangerous, unwavering register. I told her I did not care about the appetizers, the champagne, or the elite guests sitting at those tables. I instructed her to turn on the harsh, bright overhead maintenance lights in the grand ballroom and tell every single person to vacate the premises. Valerie tried to protest one last time, mentioning the reputation of the groom's family. I did not let her finish. I told her that if she did not execute my exact orders within the next 5 minutes, I would immediately call my bank and report the entire wedding transaction as massive, unauthorized credit card fraud. I promised her that I would tie the hotel up in a brutal legal dispute, and they would not receive a single dime for the extravagant catering, the floral arrangements, or the ballroom rental. I told her the choice was hers, but she was entirely out of time. I hung up the phone without waiting for her response. The silence in the car was deafening once the call disconnected. The only sound left was the rain attacking the metal roof of my vehicle. I sat there in the dark, my chest heaving, adrenaline pumping violently through my veins. I took a long, deep breath to steady myself, trying to process the absolute magnitude of what I had just done. I had just ruined my only daughter's wedding. I had just unleashed utter chaos on the people who had treated me like a disposable nuisance. A brief, grim wave of satisfaction washed over me, a feeling of taking absolute control over a situation designed to humiliate me. But that feeling of triumph lasted for exactly 3 seconds. A harsh, bright blue light suddenly illuminated the dark cabin of my car. My cell phone screen had flared to life on the passenger seat. It was a distinct high-priority notification chime from my highly secure corporate banking application. I frowned, reaching over to pick up the device. I unlocked the screen, my eyes adjusting to the glaring light. I stared at the push notification displayed on the banner. I read the words slowly, trying to comprehend the English language, but my brain refused to process the information. The alert read, "Approval successful, $2.5 million commercial loan distributed against Thorn Construction assets." My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. All the air was sucked out of the vehicle. A suffocating, freezing dread crawled up my spine and wrapped its icy fingers around my throat. I stared blankly at the glowing numbers on the screen. I had not applied for a commercial loan. I had zero debt on my company ledgers. The horrifying reality of the tax optimization documents I had signed a month ago crashed down on me with the force of a collapsing skyscraper. Morgan and Preston had not just stolen my dignity tonight. They had leveraged my entire life's work. The notification on my screen burned into my retinas. $2.5 million. I slammed the accelerator, peeling away from the curb and merging recklessly into the heavy Chicago traffic. I did not care about the blinding rain. My mind focused purely on getting back to my estate. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I built Thorn Construction with a zero-debt philosophy. I paid for my equipment in cash. I paid my workers on time. I owned my assets free and clear. A commercial loan of that magnitude against my life work was a direct attack. I pulled into the long, winding driveway of my property, the heavy wrought iron gates closing slowly behind me. I threw the car into park near the front steps, leaving the keys in the ignition and the driver's side door wide open to the storm. I marched into the grand foyer, completely ignoring the trail of rainwater dripping from my soaked tuxedo onto the pristine hardwood floors. I bypassed the massive kitchen and walked straight down the west corridor toward my private home office. The house was dead silent, a stark contrast to the roaring chaos inside my head. I pushed open the heavy oak door of my office and locked it firmly behind me. I dropped directly to my knees on the Persian rug. I shoved my heavy mahogany desk chair out of the way and pulled back the corner of the carpet to reveal the heavy steel floor safe embedded in the foundation. My breathing was shallow and rapid. I leaned in close, inspecting the circular combination dial. The ambient light from my desk lamp caught a tiny detail that made my stomach churn. The matte black paint around the edge of the metal dial was freshly scratched. Tiny silver flakes of exposed steel gleamed back at me. Someone had been hastily turning this dial. My hands shook slightly as I entered the combination. 3 turns to the right, 2 turns to the left. 1 turn to the right. I grabbed the heavy chrome handle and pulled the thick steel door upward. The hinges groaned in the quiet room. I reached inside my fingers, desperately searching the bottom compartment, where I kept my most sensitive physical records. I pulled out a stack of property deeds, some vintage family photo albums, and a bundle of old municipal bonds. I sifted through the papers frantically, tossing them onto the floor one by one. I reached into the very back of the dark metal cavity. My hand found nothing but cold, empty steel. The thick leather binder containing the supposed tax optimization documents that Morgan had relentlessly pressured me to sign was completely gone. She had taken it. Before I could fully process the gravity of the empty safe, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in the breast pocket of my wet tuxedo jacket. The relentless buzzing felt like a warning siren. I pulled the device out and stared at the screen. The notification center was entirely filled with red alerts. 40 missed calls. Most were from Morgan, but there were also frantic messages from Preston and several unknown numbers that I assumed were furious members of his elite family. As I stared at the backlog of missed connections, an incoming call took over the screen. It was Morgan again. I sat back on the floor, resting my shoulders against the wooden panels of my desk. I swiped my thumb across the glass, accepted the call, and put the phone on speaker, placing it carefully on the carpet next to the open safe. I did not say a single word. I simply waited. The sound that erupted from the speaker was pure, unadulterated hysteria. Morgan was screaming so loudly that the audio distorted into sharp bursts of static. She demanded to know where I was and what I had done. Her voice lacked any trace of the polished, elegant bride I had seen just an hour ago. She sounded like a frantic, cornered animal. She told me that the hotel management had literally turned on the harsh fluorescent maintenance lights in the middle of the grand ballroom. The string quartet had abruptly stopped playing their classical instruments mid-song. She shrieked that a team of security guards had politely but firmly asked 200 of the wealthiest, most influential political figures in Chicago to put down their forks and immediately vacate the premises. She gasped for breath, crying out that Preston was currently in the lobby screaming at the hotel manager, threatening lawsuits, while his parents stood frozen in absolute humiliation. She told me the catering staff had literally rolled the unserved filet mignon back into the kitchen and locked the doors. She accused me of being a vindictive, crazy old man. She demanded that I call the hotel back this exact second, provide a new credit card, and fix the disaster I had caused. She said I was ruining the most important night of her entire life, just because my feelings were hurt over a seating arrangement. I listened to her frantic demands, her heavy breathing, echoing in the quiet of my office. I felt a profound sense of detachment. The daughter I had raised, the little girl I had loved more than my own life, did not exist anymore. The person on the other end of the line was a parasite who had smiled while robbing me blind. I leaned forward, bringing my face closer to the phone. I kept my voice incredibly calm, completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I told her that I found it amusing how quickly she needed the rough blue-collar builder when the bills came due. I reminded her of her own words from the service hallway. I told her that she had made it explicitly clear that my presence was a stain on her new elite family. I spoke slowly, ensuring every syllable carried the weight of absolute finality. I said, "No me no wedding, enjoy your hot dogs." A suffocating silence fell over the line. I could hear the muffled sounds of chaotic voices in the background at the hotel. When Morgan finally spoke again, her voice dropped the facade of the devastated bride. It morphed into a venomous, hateful sneer. The sheer rage stripped away her careful planning and exposed her true hand. She screamed that I was a pathetic, clueless old fool. She yelled that I could not simply walk away and cut her off. She told me that I had absolutely no power left. Her voice reached a fever pitch as she spat the final fatal words. She screamed that she had full medical authority over me now and that she was going to take every single thing I owned. She slammed the phone down abruptly, ending the call. The harsh dial tone loudly echoed through the silent office, a hollow, mocking sound. I sat completely frozen on the damp, intricate Persian rug. The entire room suddenly began to spin around me in a dizzying blur. The heavy mahogany desk, the empty steel safe, the cold rainwater steadily dripping from my tuxedo jacket. It all blurred together into a nightmare. I slowly repeated her venomous words in my mind over and over again. Medical authority. The so-called tax documents I had foolishly signed were not financial at all. They were a complete, legally binding, terrifying surrender of my own physical and mental autonomy. I did not allow the initial shock to paralyze me completely. Panic is a dangerous luxury the men in my position simply cannot afford. I reached across the damp Persian rug, picked up my phone, and immediately ended the dead call with my treacherous daughter. My stiff fingers moved with mechanical precision as I scrolled through my highly encrypted contacts. I bypassed my standard financial advisors and dialed the private cellular number of Bradley Lawson. Bradley was my senior corporate attorney, a man whose absolute loyalty I had purchased over 3 decades of highly lucrative retainers. He was a bulldog in the courtroom and a ghost in the archives. It was well past midnight, but he answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was thick with sleep, but it sharpened instantly the moment he heard the chilling, absolute focus in my tone. I told him I needed an emergency audit of every legal filing attached to my name, my estate, and Thorne Construction within the last 30 days. I explained about the missing binder, the alleged tax optimization documents, and the $2.5 million commercial loan that had just been forcefully distributed against my company. Bradley did not ask unnecessary questions. I could hear the rustling of bedsheets and the heavy clicking of his mechanical keyboard as he immediately booted up his secure remote terminal. He told me to stay on the line while he tapped directly into the expedited county clerk database and the state medical registry. The silence on the phone stretched out for 10 agonizing minutes. The only sound in my office was the heavy rain lashing against the glass window and the rapid rhythmic striking of Bradley pressing keys. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual unshakable confidence. It was hollow, tense, and deeply disturbed. He asked me if I was sitting down. I told him I was already on the floor. Bradley took a heavy breath and read the official filings aloud. The documents Morgan had relentlessly pressured me to sign under the guise of an innovative corporate tax shield were a complete fabrication. They were composed of 2 distinctly devastating legal maneuvers. The first was a comprehensive, irrevocable medical power of attorney granting Morgan absolute control over my physical health, my living arrangements, and my medical treatments. The second was an unrestricted transfer of collateral authority, effectively giving Preston the legal right to leverage my construction assets. But the most horrifying revelation was the justification filed alongside these documents. Bradley read the summary of a secret expedited petition that Morgan had submitted to the probate court just 3 days ago. She was seeking a permanent guardianship order, legally declaring me mentally incompetent. Her official filing claimed I was suffering from severe, rapidly advancing, early-onset dementia, and that I was a direct danger to myself and my estate. The word dementia echoed in my quiet office like a gunshot. Suddenly, the bizarre, seemingly innocent events of the past 6 months snapped into a horrifying, brilliant focus. A deeply sinister pattern emerged from the fog of my daily routine. I finally understood why Morgan had been so aggressively insisting that I move out of the master suite and into the small ground-floor guest bedroom, claiming she was worried about my knees on the stairs. She was physically isolating me, preparing a believable environment for an invalid. I realized why she had been constantly interrupting me during board meetings and family dinners, gently correcting my memory and telling our friends that I had forgotten conversations that had never actually happened. She was planting the seeds of my alleged mental decline in the minds of dozens of credible witnesses. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, but the most chilling realization was the nightly ritual she had established over the last few weeks. Every single evening, just before bed, Morgan would bring me a steaming mug of a special herbal tea. She claimed it was an expensive, holistic blend designed to help me sleep and manage my grief over Caroline. I had drank it every night, feeling a strange, heavy brain fog the following mornings. She was not comforting me. She was chemically inducing the exact symptoms of the neurological disease she was accusing me of having. I relayed my realization to Bradley. I heard him curse softly under his breath, a rare break in his professional armor. He told me that the situation was far worse than a simple asset grab. He had just pulled the origination on the $2.5 million loan. Preston had not gone through a traditional federally regulated banking institution. His tech startup was effectively bankrupt, completely drowning in hidden debts. To save himself, Preston had used my forged collateral transfer to secure a massive high-interest loan from a shadow syndicate. It was an unregulated, highly dangerous private equity group known for employing exceptionally violent collection methods when their debtors defaulted. Preston needed raw cash to pay off his immediate threats, and he had essentially painted a giant multi-million-dollar target on my back to do it. If that money was not recovered, the people holding the debt would not take him to civil court. They would simply liquidate my assets by physical force. The brutal reality of the situation settled over me. My daughter and her new husband were entirely willing to let violent criminals dismantle my life work just to cover their own reckless financial mistakes. They viewed me as nothing more than an expendable resource, a convenient stepping stone to preserve their glamorous elite lifestyle. Bradley's voice grew extraordinarily urgent, cutting through my momentary state of shock. He informed me that the temporary guardianship order was currently pending, but Morgan had requested an emergency expedited ruling from the judge. She had leveraged her polished social connections to fast-track the entire legal proceeding behind closed doors, avoiding any standard public scrutiny. The court hearing, to finalize my legal incompetence and permanently strip me of my basic human rights, was officially scheduled for the very first thing Monday morning. I looked up at the antique grandfather clock ticking relentlessly in the corner of my dark office. The heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth, mocking my sudden lack of control over my own destiny. It was exactly 1 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. I had exactly 48 hours. 48 hours to prove to a judge that my mind was perfectly intact. 48 hours to untangle a masterful web of forged documents, chemical manipulation, and massive corporate theft. If I failed this impossible test, Morgan would legally lock me away in a secured psychiatric facility for the rest of my natural life, while she and her husband dismantled my 40-year legacy to pay off their dangerous criminal debts. I thanked Bradley profusely, hung up the phone, and slowly stood up from the damp floor. I brushed the dust off my soaked tuxedo trousers and straightened my jacket. I walked over to the mahogany desk and poured myself a neat glass of aged bourbon. I did not drink it. I merely stared at my own grim reflection in the amber liquid, feeling a dangerous fire ignite within my chest. The heartbroken father who had begged for his daughter's love outside the hotel ballroom was completely dead. The war had officially begun, and I was going to utterly destroy them using every weapon I had built. I left the bourbon untouched on the mahogany desk, toasting the absolute death of my blind paternal devotion in my mind. I picked up my cell phone for the third time that night. I scrolled past the frantic unanswered texts from Morgan and found the encrypted contact file for Garrett Nash. Garrett was a former Federal Bureau of Investigation operative who had transitioned into private corporate intelligence over a decade ago. He was the man I exclusively retained to vet ruthless competitors, trace hidden offshore accounts, and dismantle corporate espionage attempts against Thorne Construction. I was fiercely loyal, highly discreet, and completely unbothered by the late hour. I called him at 1:15 in the morning. He answered immediately, his voice sharp and fully awake. I did not give him a lengthy explanation over the phone. I simply told him that I was facing an immediate catastrophic internal breach and that I needed a complete covert surveillance grid installed inside my primary residence before sunrise. Garrett asked no questions. He told me he would be at my estate in 90 minutes with his specialized equipment. I hung up and spent the next hour meticulously wiping down the floor safe, ensuring no trace of my inspection remained. I returned my desk chair to its exact original position and smoothed out the Persian rug. I needed Morgan and Preston to believe their trap was perfectly intact. Exactly at 3 o'clock in the morning, a sleek black sedan rolled silently up my long driveway, its headlights completely extinguished. Garrett Nash stepped out into the pouring rain, carrying 2 heavy reinforced tactical cases. I unlocked the front door and let him inside. We did not exchange pleasantries or handshakes. I led him straight to the kitchen, the primary stage where Morgan prepared my nightly drugged tea. I explained the situation to Garrett in cold, clinical terms as he opened his cases on my granite kitchen island. I told him about the forged medical power of attorney, the shadow syndicate loan, and the chemical manipulation. Garrett's jaw tightened, but his professional demeanor never wavered. He immediately went to work. He pulled out a series of microscopic high-definition cameras and military-grade audio transmitters. These were not off-the-shelf security devices. They were practically invisible, designed to blend seamlessly into the environment. We started in the kitchen. Garrett carefully removed a small ventilation grate above the espresso machine, installed a tiny lens that covered the entire food preparation area, and replaced the grate without leaving a single scratch. He placed a second audio-only receiver underneath the lip of the kitchen island, perfectly positioned to capture even the lowest whispers. We moved to the main living room, the central hub where Preston and Morgan would inevitably congregate to discuss their financial strategies. Garrett embedded a camera inside the base of an antique bronze lamp, sitting on the mantel, wiring it directly to the power supply so it would never lose battery. He hid another microphone behind the heavy velvet curtains near the front entryway to catch any conversations the moment they walked through the front doors. Finally, we walked up the staircase to the ground-floor guest bedroom, the isolated cell Morgan had so graciously prepared for my supposed mental decline. This was the most critical location. This was where the final act of their deception would take place. Garrett installed a wide-angle lens inside the housing of the smoke detector on the ceiling, giving me a complete unobstructed view of the entire room, including the doorway and the bed. He synced all the devices to a secure encrypted local network that did not interact with my main house wireless router. He handed me a brand new unregistered digital tablet and showed me the live feeds. The video quality was breathtakingly clear. The audio picked up the sound of my own breathing. Every corner of the trap was perfectly primed. Garrett finished his work just before 5 o'clock in the morning. Before he left, he handed me the small encrypted burner phone, instructing me to use it only if I needed immediate physical extraction. He promised to monitor the feeds remotely from his secure vehicle, parked a few blocks away. I thanked him, locked the front door behind him, and walked slowly back to the ground-floor bedroom. The storm outside had finally begun to break, leaving behind a cold, gray pre-dawn light that filtered weakly through the blinds. I stripped off my damp, wrinkled tuxedo and threw it into the back of the closet, out of sight. I changed into a set of loose, slightly mismatched pajamas. To play the role of a helpless, demented old man, my wardrobe needed to reflect absolute vulnerability. I walked into the adjoining bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I ran my hands roughly through my hair, messing it up to make it look unkempt and neglected. I practiced relaxing the muscles in my face, dulling the sharp, calculating look in my eyes, and adopting a vacant, confused stare. I needed to become the hollow shell that Morgan so desperately wanted me to be. I walked back into the bedroom and climbed into the bed. I pulled the heavy duvet up to my chest. I took the unregistered digital tablet Garrett had given me, dimmed the screen brightness to its lowest setting, and hid it carefully under the thick blankets resting on my lap. I brought up the live surveillance grid, dividing the screen to show the front entryway, the kitchen, and the living room simultaneously. The house was perfectly still, but it was the deafening silence before an absolute massacre. I lay there in the dark, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic, and deadly calm. I was no longer a grieving father, mourning the loss of his family. I was a spider sitting dead center in a highly lethal web, patiently waiting for the flies to arrive. The digital clock on the bedside table slowly ticked forward. 6 o'clock. 6:30. The gray light outside slowly brightened into a pale morning. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy mahogany front doors of my estate did not just open. They burst inward with a violent echoing crash that vibrated through the floorboards. I flinched, but quickly forced my body to remain perfectly still under the covers. On the glowing screen hidden beneath my blanket, I watched the live feed from the entryway. Preston Gaines stormed into the house. His rented tuxedo from the night before completely ruined his tie, undone his hair wild and dripping with residual rainwater. Morgan followed closely behind him, her face pale, her bridal makeup smeared under her eyes, her expression twisted into a mask of pure, frantic panic. Preston kicked a small decorative table near the door, sending a vase crashing to the hardwood floor. I heard his voice echo down the long hallway, loud, desperate, and filled with venomous rage. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know where the old man was, shouting that I had completely ruined everything. I did not move a single muscle. I closed my eyes for a brief second, took a deep, steadying breath, and purposefully slowed my heart rate. I adjusted my tight grip on the hidden digital tablet, opened my eyes, and watched the live feed as my daughter and her husband marched furiously down the hall toward my bedroom. Completely unaware of the trap, I held my breath as their footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. The brass handle turned slowly, making a faint clicking sound. I kept my eyes closed, breathing in the slow rhythm of a medicated old man. Through the narrow slit of my eyelids, I saw Preston peek his head into the room. He stared at me for a tense moment, listening to the steady rise and fall of my chest. He let out a harsh sigh of relief, muttered something, and pulled the door shut. The latch clicked. I immediately looked down at the glowing screen of the digital tablet hidden beneath my heavy duvet. I switched the primary feed to the kitchen camera Garrett had concealed inside the ventilation grate above the espresso machine. A few seconds later, Preston and Morgan burst into the frame. The high-definition lens captured every detail of their desperate state. Preston aggressively paced across the imported marble tiles, running trembling hands through his wet hair. He looked like a cornered rat. His rented tuxedo was entirely ruined from the storm, sticking to his shoulders in damp patches. Morgan leaned against the granite island, chewing frantically on her thumbnail. The elegant bride who had coldly banished me from the Waldorf Astoria was entirely gone, replaced by a woman consumed by raw panic. Preston suddenly slammed his fist onto the countertop, causing a row of empty wine glasses to rattle violently. He screamed that they were completely out of time. He yelled that my stunt at the hotel had severed their only immediate line of credit with the catering vendors and exposed their cash flow problem to his wealthy parents. Morgan tried to shush him, darting her eyes nervously toward the hallway leading to my bedroom. But Preston was far beyond caution. He grabbed the edge of the granite island, leaning his face inches from hers. His voice dropped into a guttural, terrifying register that made my blood run cold. He told her she did not understand the gravity of the people they were dealing with. I explained that the shadow syndicate, holding the $2.5 million commercial loan against my construction firm, had given him a hard deadline. They did not operate like a traditional bank. There were no grace periods, no warning letters, and absolutely no legal arbitration. Preston's voice cracked with genuine terror as he revealed that the syndicate had explicitly threatened his life. He told Morgan that if he did not deliver the liquidated cash from the sale of my company by Tuesday afternoon, they were going to kill him. He described the physical threats the debt collectors had made against him just an hour ago. I lay perfectly still, absorbing the full reality of my situation. My son-in-law had borrowed millions from ruthless criminals to salvage his pathetic startup, using my 40 years of sacrifice as his personal collateral. Facing execution, he was fully prepared to dismantle my legacy to save his skin. Morgan did not look horrified by these violent criminals. She did not express concern for my safety. Her only reaction was a calculated frustration at the compressed timeline. She crossed her arms tightly and began to pace the kitchen, her mind racing to find a solution involving my legal destruction. She shed no tears for the terrified man she had married. She was entirely focused on securing the vast fortune she firmly believed was already hers. Her lack of human decency was astonishing. I watched on the high-definition screen as Morgan stopped pacing. She turned on her heel and walked directly toward the massive stainless steel refrigerator. She pulled the heavy door open and reached into the back of the top shelf, completely hidden from normal view. When she turned back around to face the hidden camera, she was holding a small, unmarked glass vial filled with a clear liquid. A medical dropper was tightly screwed into the top. She set the vial down on the granite countertop with a sharp clink. Preston stared at the small bottle, his eyes wide with desperate anticipation. Morgan leaned forward, resting her hands on the counter. She told Preston to calm down and stop acting like a panicked child. Her voice was chillingly steady, completely devoid of human empathy. She looked directly at the vial and hissed her horrific plan to her husband. She told him she would double the dose of haloperidol in my morning herbal tea today. The name of the drug hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Haloperidol, a powerful, highly restricted antipsychotic medication typically used to treat severe schizophrenia. I knew the name because Caroline had once been prescribed a low dose during her final days in hospice. Morgan calmly explained to Preston that administering a heavy, concentrated dose of this specific neuroleptic drug perfectly mimics the absolute worst stages of severe advanced dementia. She said it causes extreme mental confusion, uncontrollable physical tremors, sluggish motor functions, and profound cognitive detachment. She smiled a cruel, heartless smile and told Preston that by the time the court-appointed medical evaluator arrived at the house tomorrow morning, I would not even know my own name. My own flesh and blood, the daughter I had protected my entire life, was actively and intentionally, chemically lobotomizing me. The sheer clinical evil of her statement paralyzed me. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. I watched as Preston stared at the vial of powerful antipsychotic medication, a sick expression of relief washing over his pale face. But the relief was entirely fleeting. He reached out and grabbed Morgan tightly by the arm, his fingers digging into her skin. He shook his head frantically. He told her that waiting for the court-appointed evaluator tomorrow morning was no longer an option. The timeline had shifted. He reminded her that the final transfer of my construction empire to Vanguard Holdings was scheduled to be executed today. He explained that Richard Maxwell, the notoriously ruthless chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, required absolute legally binding authorization to finalize the massive corporate acquisition. Preston's eyes darted wildly toward the hallway. He told Morgan the forged medical power of attorney and preliminary digital signatures were no longer enough to satisfy the Shadow Syndicate's demand for proof of the sale. They needed undeniable verification that the corporate asset transfer was finalized. Preston lowered his voice to a desperate whisper. He said they needed my physical thumbprint stamped directly onto the final Vanguard Holdings transfer documents today before the banks closed. Morgan looked at the vial of haloperidol, then back to Preston. Her eyes narrowed with a dark, predatory determination. She nodded slowly in agreement. Preston released her arm, grabbed a stack of legal papers from his leather briefcase, and pulled a small black ink pad from his pocket. He looked at Morgan and said they needed to do it right now while the old man was passed out from last night's dose. I held my breath, gripping the digital tablet under my blankets. On the screen, I watched them turn away from the kitchen counter and march purposefully out of the frame. 2 seconds later, I heard the heavy, unmistakable sound of their footsteps pounding rapidly up the wooden hallway floorboards, heading directly toward the closed door of my bedroom. The rapid footsteps echoed down the hallway, vibrating through the floorboards and straight into the mattress where I lay. I kept my eyes completely shut and concentrated entirely on the rhythm of my breathing. I needed to mimic the slow, shallow respirations of a man incapacitated by a heavy dose of antipsychotic medication. My muscles were tense, coiled like a tightly wound spring, but I forced my facial expression to go completely slack. I let my jaw drop open slightly, ensuring that I looked exactly like the hollow, broken shell my daughter so desperately needed me to be. The brass doorknob turned with a sharp click. The heavy oak door creaked open, letting a sliver of pale morning light slice across the dark bedroom. I did not move. I did not flinch. Through the narrow slit of my eyelashes, I saw 2 dark silhouettes step quietly into the room. Preston moved with a frantic, nervous energy, clutching a thick leather portfolio under his arm. Morgan followed close behind him, closing the door softly until it latched. They stood at the foot of my bed for a long, agonizing moment, staring down at me. I could feel their eyes analyzing my stillness, searching for any sign of wakefulness. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Preston breathing heavily. He was sweating, terrified of the shadow syndicate that was currently hunting him down for their money. Preston stepped closer to the right side of the bed, setting his leather portfolio down on the mahogany nightstand. He unzipped the portfolio with trembling hands, pulling out a thick stack of densely printed legal documents. He spread them out flat on the smooth surface. Morgan walked around to the left side of the bed, her eyes fixed coldly on my face. She did not look at me with an ounce of hesitation. She nodded sharply at her husband, giving him the silent authorization to proceed with the final, irreversible theft of my life's work. Preston reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black ink pad. He popped the plastic lid off and set it next to the documents. He leaned over the mattress, his shadow blocking the pale light from the window. I felt his clammy, shaking fingers wrap aggressively around my right wrist. He pulled my arm out from under the heavy down duvet. His grip was devoid of any familial respect. He handled my arm as if I were already a lifeless corpse. He manipulated my hand, isolating my right thumb, and pressed it firmly down onto the spongy, wet surface of the black ink pad. The cold, dark ink seeped into the deep calluses I had earned over 40 years of building Thorn construction. Preston lifted my hand, moved it over the nightstand, and pressed my blackened thumb down hard onto the signature line of the first legal document. He did not stop there. He hastily flipped the thick page and pressed my thumb down again, leaving a second dark print. He flipped another page and stamped a third time. I felt a burning volcanic rage building in the core of my chest. The sheer physical violation of my son-in-law forcing my body to sign away my empire was almost unbearable. I wanted nothing more than to grab him by the throat and throw him through the glass window. But I knew a premature confrontation would destroy my advantage. I had to let them think they were winning. As Preston pressed my thumb down onto the fourth and final page of the legal transfer, I initiated the next phase of my performance. I let out a low, gravelly groan, allowing my body to shift restlessly against the mattress. Preston gasped, dropping my wrist as if he had just been burned by a hot iron. He stumbled backward, knocking his hip against the edge of the nightstand. Morgan froze on the opposite side of the bed, her eyes wide with sudden panic. I slowly blinked my eyes open, staring blankly up at the ceiling fan, where I knew Garrett had installed the microscopic surveillance camera. I let my gaze wander aimlessly around the room, ensuring my eyes looked completely unfocused and lost. I parted my lips and let out a dry, hacking cough. I forced my voice to sound weak, slurred, and profoundly confused. I turned my head slowly toward my daughter. I looked directly into her eyes and mumbled the name of my late wife. I asked if Caroline was there. I asked why it was so dark outside, and why the lumberyard had not called me for my morning shift yet. I let my head loll back against the pillows, portraying a man whose mind was entirely trapped in a distorted, distant past. The panic on Morgan's face instantly dissolved. It was replaced by a look of sheer, cruel satisfaction. She looked at Preston, who was still clutching the nightstand, and let out a quiet, mocking laugh. The twisted validation in her eyes was horrifying to witness. She genuinely believed the chemical cocktail of antipsychotic drugs had successfully lobotomized my brain. She walked slowly around the foot of the bed, stepping right next to Preston. She looked down at me with absolute disdain. She did not try to comfort the confused, broken man she thought she saw. Instead, she leaned over, her voice dripping with a venomous, patronizing sweetness. She told me to just go back to sleep. She told me that Caroline was not here and that my mind was completely gone. She reached down, grabbed the heavy duvet, and roughly pulled it up over my chest, treating me like a burdensome chore she could not wait to be rid of. Preston quickly gathered the ink-stained documents, shoved them back into his leather portfolio, and zipped it shut. He grabbed the ink pad, shoved it into his jacket pocket, and grabbed Morgan by the elbow. They did not say another word. They turned their backs on me and hurried out of the bedroom, pulling the heavy oak door completely shut behind them. The second the latch clicked, the confused old man vanished. I threw the duvet off my chest and swung my legs over the mattress. I stood up, my mind perfectly sharp, my heart beating with the calculated precision of a predator preparing to strike. I walked into the adjoining bathroom. I turned on the faucet, grabbed a scrub brush and a bar of pumice soap, and violently scrubbed the thick black ink off my right thumb. I watched the dark water swirl down the porcelain drain, washing away the physical evidence of their pathetic crime. I dried my hands and walked back into the bedroom. I reached under the mattress and pulled out the burner phone Garrett had given me. A single text message was waiting on the screen. Garrett had been monitoring the live high-definition video feed from the smoke detector camera directly above the nightstand. The camera perfectly captured the documents Preston had laid out. I opened the message and read the horrifying details. Garrett confirmed the paperwork Preston had just stamped with my physical thumbprint was a comprehensive, legally binding agreement to sell my entire commercial construction empire to Vanguard Holdings. They were liquidating 40 years of my blood, sweat and tears for a tiny fraction of its market worth to generate the cash they needed to pay off the shadow syndicate. The notification flashing on my secure burner phone forced a cold, calculating calm over my entire mind. They were attempting to sell my commercial construction empire to Vanguard Holdings for a fraction of its market worth, desperate to liquidate the cash they needed to pay off the shadow syndicate. The name Vanguard Holdings hung in the air of my quiet bedroom like a heavy fog. I knew that company intimately. It was a massive corporate conglomerate ruled by a man named Richard Maxwell. Richard and I were fierce, bitter rivals back in the 1990s. We had fought tooth and nail over every major commercial zoning contract, every lucrative municipal bid, and every prime piece of real estate in the greater Chicago area. We had spent millions of dollars trying to outbid, outmaneuver, and outlast each other in high-stakes boardrooms and tense city council meetings. We openly despised each other on a deeply personal level during those ruthless years, constantly trading vicious, highly publicized verbal blows in the local business press. But beneath that intense, decades-long hatred, there was an unspoken, fundamental code of honor between us. Richard was a relentless, aggressive capitalist, but fundamentally, he was a builder just like me. He respected the immense sweat, the profound financial risk, and the agonizing physical toll it took to construct a legitimate empire from the dirt up. He would gladly steal a multi-million-dollar contract right out from under my nose, but he would never stab a man in the back while he was sleeping. He utterly despised cowardly tactics, and he harbored a particular well-known hatred for young, entitled trust fund kids who tried to play dangerous corporate games without ever putting in the actual work. I reached under my duvet and gripped the encrypted burner phone. I looked at the digital clock glowing on the bedside table. It was 6:45 in the morning. Richard was famously an early riser, a man who claimed that sleeping past 5 o'clock was a sign of moral weakness. I punched in a highly private, unlisted cellular number I had committed to memory 2 decades ago. The line rang 3 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered, barking his last name with characteristic impatience. I did not bother with a polite introduction or fake pleasantries. I simply stated my name and told him I needed exactly 5 minutes of his time for the most critical business proposition of our lives. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I heard the faint clink of a coffee cup being set down on a glass table. Richard finally spoke, his voice laced with a mixture of suspicion and genuine curiosity. He asked me why a dead man was calling his private line before the stock market even opened. I ignored his sharp, probing jab and immediately laid all my cards on the table. I explained the entire horrifying situation to my oldest enemy in cold, methodical, unvarnished detail. I told him about my only daughter and her monstrous chemical manipulation. I told him about Preston Gaines, the massive hidden corporate debt, and the violent shadow syndicate currently threatening his life. I detailed the forged medical power of attorney, the midnight thumbprint, and the frantic, desperate plan to liquidate my life work to his acquisition team for pennies on the dollar later that very afternoon. I did not ask for his pity, and I did not ask for his charity. I asked for his absolute cooperation in executing a flawless, devastating counterstrike against the boy who thought he could play us both for fools. I listened silently as Richard processed the overwhelming information. The heavy silence stretched out, broken only by his slow, measured, angry breathing. When he finally responded, the sheer disgust in his voice was palpable. He told me that Preston had actually approached his senior acquisition team just 2 days ago, acting incredibly arrogant and wearing a cheap suit. He said Preston had claimed that his father-in-law was tragically losing his mind to dementia and urgently needed to liquidate vast corporate assets to cover long-term specialized medical care. Richard admitted he had smelled a rat immediately, specifically noting that the asking price was insultingly low for an enterprise as historically robust and profitable as Thorne Construction. He expressed a profound, violent revulsion at Preston's utter lack of backbone. Richard told me that pathetic little boys who poisoned their own family members for a quick payout disgusted him more than anything else on this earth. We spent the next 20 minutes hatching a meticulous, airtight, utterly ruthless trap for the scheduled signing. Richard agreed to play along perfectly, officially inviting Preston into his private glass-walled boardroom under the guise of finalizing the massive corporate acquisition. We synchronized our timelines down to the exact unforgiving minute. I thanked him quietly, and for the first time in 30 years, the mutual respect between two old war dogs was explicitly clear and understood. I ended the secure call and slipped the burner phone back under my mattress just as the floorboards in the hallway began to creak again. I scrambled back under the duvet, resuming my helpless position, and let my jaw go completely slack. The brass doorknob turned, and the heavy oak door swung wide open. Morgan walked into the room carrying a ceramic mug on a small silver tray. The hot steam rising from the dark liquid carried the faint scent of her special herbal tea. She walked over to the mahogany nightstand, her designer heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. She did not look at me with any lingering trace of guilt or hesitation for what she and her husband had just done in the dark. She looked at me with the cold, sterile, terrifying efficiency of a ruthless executioner preparing to deliver the final, fatal blow. I let out a weak, pathetic groan and slowly opened my eyes, blinking heavily against the pale morning light filtering through the window blinds. I reached out with a violently trembling hand, perfectly faking the severe, debilitating motor function decline caused by a massive concentrated dose of antipsychotic medication. I grasped the warm ceramic mug, letting my fingers slip clumsily against the smooth, painted surface. Morgan watched my pathetic struggle with a twisted, impatient, and deeply satisfied smirk. I brought the mug halfway to my lips, then suddenly jerked my chest forward and faked a violent, uncontrollable, choking, coughing fit. I convulsed wildly, throwing my weight heavily to the side, and deliberately dropped the mug directly into the small porcelain sink basin attached to the vanity near the bed. The dark, poisoned liquid splashed violently down the metal drain, completely washing away the toxic, mind-altering dose of haloperidol she had so carefully prepared to destroy me. Morgan let out a sharp, furious sigh, rolling her eyes in deep, unfiltered annoyance as she abruptly pulled her buzzing cell phone out of her pocket to check an urgent incoming message. She did not even bother to clean up the spilled liquid or check to see if I was choking. She simply looked down at me, her voice dripping with cruel, icy, and victorious anticipation. She told me to drink whatever was left in the broken cup. She said the court-appointed doctor was coming to evaluate my broken mind in exactly 1 hour. I lay in the quiet bedroom, counting the seconds. 60 agonizing minutes stretched out like a lifetime. I used that hour to craft the precise persona I needed. I slowed my breathing, allowed my shoulders to slump, and let a vacant glaze settle over my eyes. I needed to look like a man whose cognitive foundation had crumbled. Right on schedule, the heavy brass knocker echoed through the hallway. I tapped the hidden digital tablet to bring up the live feed. Morgan opened the door to reveal a man in a slim-fit navy suit holding a sleek leather briefcase. He did not look like a dedicated medical professional. He looked like a corporate fixer. His hair was slicked back, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his smile devoid of any genuine bedside manner. This was Dr. Aris, the corrupt physician Preston had undoubtedly bribed to finalize my destruction. I watched as Preston greeted the doctor with a tense handshake. They exchanged a brief, meaningful look before Morgan led the way toward my ground-floor bedroom. I quickly shoved the tablet back beneath the mattress and let my head loll against the pillows. The door opened with a soft creak. Dr. Aris stepped into the room, followed closely by Morgan and Preston. They stood at the foot of my bed, staring down at me as if I were already a corpse. The doctor approached my bedside, pulling a silver pen and a notepad from his briefcase. He leaned over, speaking to me in a sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone, usually reserved for a toddler. He asked me how I was feeling today. I did not look at him directly. I let my gaze wander aimlessly around the room, settling on a blank spot on the wall. I mumbled that I was just very tired and that my bones ached. Dr. Aris scribbled a note, his face an impassive mask. He then began the standard cognitive assessment protocol. He asked me to state my full name. I gave it to him, but I intentionally slurred my words, making my speech sound thick and uncoordinated. He then asked me if I knew where I was. I blinked slowly, furrowed my brow, and whispered that I was in my old apartment on the south side of Chicago, a place I had not lived in for over 40 years. Morgan let out a soft, dramatic sigh, placing a comforting hand on Preston's shoulder to play the role of the devastated daughter. Dr. Aris nodded sympathetically, though his eyes remained cold. He moved to the next phase of the evaluation. He asked me to tell him the current day of the week, the month, and the exact year. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was where I would lay the foundation for their future criminal prosecution. I looked up at Dr. Aris, squinting, as if trying to peer through a dense fog. I confidently told him it was Tuesday, November the 4th, 1998. I was off by decades. Dr. Aris immediately lowered his pen to document my severe disorientation, but I did not stop speaking. I kept my voice weak and raspy, but seamlessly transitioned my rambling answer into a highly complex monologue about corporate finance. I told the doctor that since it was the fourth quarter of the fiscal year, we urgently needed to restructure the capital gains tax liabilities on the upcoming municipal development contracts. I casually mentioned that according to the revised federal tax codes, we needed to utilize a specific accelerated depreciation schedule on our heavy machinery assets to offset the projected revenue spikes. I continued my supposed disjointed rambling by instructing him to double-check the compliance regulations on our employee retirement accounts, referencing the strict fiduciary responsibilities outlined under the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. I laid out a flawless asset liquidation strategy, using precise technical legal jargon that a man suffering from severe dementia could never possibly comprehend, let alone articulate with flawless grammatical structure. I was serving him undeniable proof of my pristine cognitive health on a silver platter. Any legitimate medical professional would have immediately halted the evaluation, recognizing that my complex financial directives contradicted the profile of a dying man. But Dr. Aris did not even blink. He ignored the glaring inconsistency in my speech. He simply kept his head down and methodically checked off the boxes on his assessment form, documenting my profound cognitive failure. He was only hearing what he had been paid to hear. Dr. Aris finished his fraudulent assessment, clicked his pen shut, and slid his notepad back into his briefcase. He turned to Morgan and Preston, adopting a somber, deeply sympathetic expression. He told them my mental decline was unfortunately advanced and entirely irreversible. He stated I was unequivocally incapable of managing my physical care or complex financial estate. Morgan covered her mouth with her hand, producing fake tears. Preston thanked the doctor profusely and suggested they step out into the hallway to finalize the medical paperwork. They left the bedroom, shutting the heavy oak door. The moment the latch clicked, the confused old man vanished. I threw off the heavy duvet, grabbed the hidden tablet from under the mattress, and switched the live feed to the camera Garrett had concealed in the hallway smoke detector. The lens captured them, standing near the entryway. Preston reached inside the breast pocket of his ruined tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick, bulging white envelope. He pressed it firmly into the hands of Dr. Aris. The doctor discreetly squeezed the envelope and slid it into his briefcase. With the bribe successfully transferred, Dr. Aris pulled out a pristine, legally binding medical affidavit. He signed his name at the bottom of the page with a smooth, practiced flourish. He officially declared me mentally incompetent under the full penalty of perjury. He handed the executed document to Preston, shook his hand, and quietly let himself out the front door. On the screen, I watched Preston clutch the signed medical affidavit to his chest. His posture instantly transformed from a terrified debtor into a man who believed he had conquered the world. A massive, arrogant smile spread across his face. He looked at Morgan, his eyes wild with greedy triumph. He held up the document and declared that it was perfect. He told her he was heading directly to the corporate headquarters of Vanguard Holdings right now. He stated that once he formally signed the asset transfer papers with my forged thumbprint and this medical clearance, the old man's entire construction empire would finally be his. He kissed Morgan fiercely and sprinted out the front door, the heavy wood slamming shut behind him. I did not waste another second. I dropped the tablet onto the unmade bed and stripped off the loose pajamas I had worn to play their pathetic victim. I walked over to the mahogany armoire, opened the heavy doors, and pulled out a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit I had specifically set aside for this exact occasion. I dressed with mechanical, ruthless efficiency. I fastened a dark silk tie around my neck, slipped on a pair of polished leather Oxfords, and strapped a sleek silver watch to my wrist. I checked my reflection in the full-length mirror. The vulnerable, broken father was completely gone. The aggressive, calculating founder of Thorn Construction stared back at me, ready for absolute war. I grabbed my keys, unlocked my bedroom door, and marched down the hallway. The drive from my estate to the financial district of downtown Chicago took exactly 40 minutes. The heavy morning storm had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp chill in the air and streets that gleamed like polished black obsidian under the midday sun. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car, feeling a profound sense of clarity that I had not experienced in decades. The man who had lain in that bed pretending to be a hollow shell ravaged by dementia was completely gone. He had been replaced by the ruthless, uncompromising builder who had forged an empire out of concrete and sheer willpower. I navigated the familiar city streets with aggressive precision. Every corner, every towering skyscraper, every steel bridge I passed was a testament to the world I belonged to. It was a world of hard truths, binding contracts, and absolute consequences. Preston Gaines, a spoiled child, who had never built anything of value in his entire pathetic life, was currently attempting to steal a massive piece of that world. He genuinely believed that a forged medical document and an ink-stained thumbprint were enough to conquer a veteran of corporate warfare. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about the predators who actually ruled this city. I pulled my vehicle into the underground executive parking garage of the Vanguard Holdings skyscraper. I did not bother with the visitor parking levels. I drove straight to the reserved private bays, parking my car in a spot designated for senior partners. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the echoing concrete cavern. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal gray suit, adjusted my silk tie, and walked purposefully toward the private executive elevator. I bypassed the standard security checkpoints entirely. Richard Maxwell had personally ensured that my path would be completely unobstructed. I pressed the silver button for the 50th floor, the pinnacle of the Vanguard Empire. As the high-speed elevator shot upward, I watched the digital floor numbers flash rapidly on the display panel. With every passing floor, the burning anger in my chest compressed into a cold, diamond-hard focus. I was not walking into a simple negotiation. I was walking into a corporate execution. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime revealing the sprawling, hyper-modern reception area of Vanguard Holdings. The entire floor was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, while the interior was dominated by sleek glass walls, polished marble floors, and dark steel accents. A highly polished executive assistant sat behind a massive curved reception desk. She looked up as I stepped out of the elevator. She did not ask for my name or demand to see my identification. Richard had clearly briefed her. She simply offered a crisp, professional nod, stood up, and gestured silently down the long, sunlit corridor toward the primary executive boardroom. I walked past her without breaking my stride. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my leather Oxfords, allowing me to approach the boardroom with the stealth of a hunting predator. The main boardroom was located at the very end of the corridor. It was a massive, intimidating space encased entirely in soundproof double-paned glass. As I walked closer, I could see the scene unfolding inside with crystal clarity. I stopped a few feet away from the heavy oak and glass doors, remaining perfectly concealed in the shadow of a large structural pillar. I stood perfectly still and observed the prey. Preston Gaines was sitting near the center of the massive, custom-built mahogany conference table. His ruined rain-soaked tuxedo had been replaced by a hastily purchased ill-fitting navy blue suit. I was leaning back in his expensive leather ergonomic chair, his legs casually crossed, exuding an aura of unearned, arrogant triumph. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had just successfully pulled off the greatest financial heist of the century. Sitting directly across the wide table from him was Richard Maxwell. Richard looked exactly as he had 20 years ago, a formidable, deeply intimidating figure with sharp eyes and a posture carved from solid rock. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the polished wood. Preston leaned forward, his mouth moving rapidly. Though the soundproof glass blocked their exact words, his aggressive, overly confident body language told the entire story. He gestured animatedly with his hands, pointing down at the thick stack of legal documents resting between them. I recognized the documents immediately. It was the comprehensive asset transfer agreement bearing my forged, ink-stained thumbprints. Preston reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out the crisp white medical affidavit that the bribed physician, Dr. Aris, had signed just 2 hours ago. He slid the fraudulent medical document across the mahogany table toward Richard, tapping his finger against the paper with a sickening, triumphant smirk. I watched as Preston puffed out his chest, leaning back, and gesturing broadly, clearly, boasting to Richard about his absolute legal control over his allegedly senile father-in-law. He was painting a tragic, highly convincing picture of an old man whose mind had completely deteriorated, claiming that he was stepping in as the responsible family patriarch to liquidate the assets for my own supposed medical benefit. Richard Maxwell picked up the medical affidavit. He adjusted his reading glasses and scrutinized the document slowly. I could see the subtle, barely perceptible tightening of Richard's jaw. He was a man who despised weakness and deceit, and sitting across from him was the very embodiment of both. Richard set the paper back down on the table. He looked up at Preston and offered a slow, cold, measured nod. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. He uncapped the pen and held it poised over the final signature line of the multi-million-dollar acquisition agreement. Preston's eyes went incredibly wide. He leaned forward, literally holding his breath in desperate anticipation, watching the golden tip of the pen hover over the paper that would save him from the violent shadow syndicate. That was my cue. I stepped out from the shadow of the structural pillar and walked directly toward the boardroom. I did not knock. I reached out, grasped the heavy polished steel handles of the massive oak and glass doors, and pushed them violently open. The heavy doors swung inward with a loud, authoritative thud that shattered the quiet, tense atmosphere of the boardroom. I stepped over the threshold and walked into the center of the room. I stood impeccably dressed, my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders broad, exuding an aura of absolute, undisputed authority. The heavy, polished leather of my shoes echoed sharply against the hardwood floor. The reaction was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying. Preston's head snapped toward the doorway. The smug, arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his skin so rapidly that he looked like a freshly exhumed corpse. His jaw literally dropped open, his mouth hanging agape as he stared at me. He gripped the edges of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white, looking as though he had just witnessed a dead man walk out of a grave. The pen he had been holding clattered loudly onto the polished wood, rolling off the edge and hitting the floor. I did not say a single word. I simply stood there, staring down at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. I let the crushing, heavy silence fill the massive room, allowing the horrifying reality of his situation to completely suffocate him. Preston scrambled backward in his ergonomic chair, bumping against the glass wall behind him. He raised a trembling hand, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. He struggled to draw breath, his chest heaving in rapid, panicked spasms. His voice cracked, coming out as a pathetic, high-pitched stammer. He gasped, sputtering frantically, asking what I was doing there. He yelled that I could not possibly be standing in this building because I was severely sick and completely out of my mind. Richard Maxwell slowly placed his gold-plated fountain pen down onto the table. He did not look at the forged documents. He kept his sharp, predatory eyes locked entirely on the terrified, trembling boy sitting across from him. Richard folded his hands together, leaning forward over the mahogany table. A slow, chilling, profoundly dangerous smile spread across Richard's weathered face. He spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that echoed clearly through the massive glass boardroom. He asked Preston if he genuinely believed that he would ever buy his oldest, most respected rival's entire construction company from a pathetic, scheming little rat without picking up the phone and calling him first. The drive from my estate to the financial district of downtown Chicago took exactly 40 minutes. The heavy morning storm had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp chill in the air and streets that gleamed like polished black obsidian under the midday sun. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car, feeling a profound sense of clarity that I had not experienced in decades. The man who had lain in that bed pretending to be a hollow shell ravaged by dementia was completely gone. He had been replaced by the ruthless, uncompromising builder who had forged an empire out of concrete and sheer willpower. I navigated the familiar city streets with aggressive precision. Every corner, every towering skyscraper, every steel bridge I passed was a testament to the world I belonged to. It was a world of hard truths, binding contracts, and absolute consequences. Preston Gaines, a spoiled child, who had never built anything of value in his entire pathetic life, was currently attempting to steal a massive piece of that world. He genuinely believed that a forged medical document and an ink-stained thumbprint were enough to conquer a veteran of corporate warfare. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about the predators who actually ruled this city. I pulled my vehicle into the underground executive parking garage of the Vanguard Holdings skyscraper. I did not bother with the visitor parking levels. I drove straight to the reserved private bays, parking my car in a spot designated for senior partners. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the echoing concrete cavern. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal gray suit, adjusted my silk tie, and walked purposefully toward the private executive elevator. I bypassed the standard security checkpoints entirely. Richard Maxwell had personally ensured that my path would be completely unobstructed. I pressed the silver button for the 50th floor, the pinnacle of the Vanguard Empire. As the high-speed elevator shot upward, I watched the digital floor numbers flash rapidly on the display panel. With every passing floor, the burning anger in my chest compressed into a cold, diamond-hard focus. I was not walking into a simple negotiation. I was walking into a corporate execution. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime revealing the sprawling, hyper-modern reception area of Vanguard Holdings. The entire floor was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, while the interior was dominated by sleek glass walls, polished marble floors, and dark steel accents. A highly polished executive assistant sat behind a massive curved reception desk. She looked up as I stepped out of the elevator. She did not ask for my name or demand to see my identification. Richard had clearly briefed her. She simply offered a crisp, professional nod, stood up, and gestured silently down the long, sunlit corridor toward the primary executive boardroom. I walked past her without breaking my stride. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my leather Oxfords, allowing me to approach the boardroom with the stealth of a hunting predator. The main boardroom was located at the very end of the corridor. It was a massive, intimidating space encased entirely in soundproof double-paned glass. As I walked closer, I could see the scene unfolding inside with crystal clarity. I stopped a few feet away from the heavy oak and glass doors, remaining perfectly concealed in the shadow of a large structural pillar. I stood perfectly still and observed the prey. Preston Gaines was sitting near the center of the massive, custom-built mahogany conference table. His ruined, rain-soaked tuxedo had been replaced by a hastily purchased, ill-fitting navy blue suit. I was leaning back in his expensive leather ergonomic chair, his legs casually crossed, exuding an aura of unearned, arrogant triumph. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had just successfully pulled off the greatest financial heist of the century. Sitting directly across the wide table from him was Richard Maxwell. Richard looked exactly as he had 20 years ago, a formidable, deeply intimidating figure with sharp eyes and a posture carved from solid rock. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the polished wood. Preston leaned forward, his mouth moving rapidly. Though the soundproof glass blocked their exact words, his aggressive, overly confident body language told the entire story. He gestured animatedly with his hands, pointing down at the thick stack of legal documents resting between them. I recognized the documents immediately. It was the comprehensive asset transfer agreement bearing my forged ink-stained thumbprints. Preston reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out the crisp white medical affidavit that the bribed physician, Dr. Aris, had signed just 2 hours ago. He slid the fraudulent medical document across the mahogany table toward Richard, tapping his finger against the paper with a sickening, triumphant smirk. I watched as Preston puffed out his chest, leaning back, and gesturing broadly, clearly, boasting to Richard about his absolute legal control over his allegedly senile father-in-law. He was painting a tragic, highly convincing picture of an old man whose mind had completely deteriorated, claiming that he was stepping in as the responsible family patriarch to liquidate the assets for my own supposed medical benefit. Richard Maxwell picked up the medical affidavit. He adjusted his reading glasses and scrutinized the document slowly. I could see the subtle, barely perceptible tightening of Richard's jaw. He was a man who despised weakness and deceit, and sitting across from him was the very embodiment of both. Richard set the paper back down on the table. He looked up at Preston and offered a slow, cold, measured nod. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. He uncapped the pen and held it poised over the final signature line of the multi-million-dollar acquisition agreement. Preston's eyes went incredibly wide. He leaned forward, literally holding his breath in desperate anticipation, watching the golden tip of the pen hover over the paper that would save him from the violent shadow syndicate. That was my cue. I stepped out from the shadow of the structural pillar and walked directly towards the boardroom. I did not knock. I reached out, grasped the heavy polished steel handles of the massive oak and glass doors, and pushed them violently open. The heavy doors swung inward with a loud, authoritative thud that shattered the quiet, tense atmosphere of the boardroom. I stepped over the threshold and walked into the center of the room. I stood impeccably dressed, my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders broad, exuding an aura of absolute, undisputed authority. The heavy polished leather of my shoes echoed sharply against the hardwood floor. The reaction was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying. Preston's head snapped toward the doorway. The smug, arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his skin so rapidly that he looked like a freshly exhumed corpse. His jaw literally dropped open, his mouth hanging agape as he stared at me. He gripped the edges of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white, looking as though he had just witnessed a dead man walk out of a grave. The pen he had been holding clattered loudly onto the polished wood, rolling off the edge and hitting the floor. I did not say a single word. I simply stood there staring down at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. I let the crushing, heavy silence fill the massive room, allowing the horrifying reality of his situation to completely suffocate him. Preston scrambled backward in his ergonomic chair, bumping against the glass wall behind him. He raised a trembling hand, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. He struggled to draw breath, his chest heaving in rapid, panicked spasms. His voice cracked, coming out as a pathetic, high-pitched stammer. He gasped, sputtering frantically, asking what I was doing there. He yelled that I could not possibly be standing in this building because I was severely sick and completely out of my mind. Richard Maxwell slowly placed his gold-plated fountain pen down onto the table. He did not look at the forged documents. He kept his sharp, predatory eyes locked entirely on the terrified, trembling boy sitting across from him. Richard folded his hands together, leaning forward over the mahogany table. A slow, chilling, profoundly dangerous smile spread across Richard's weathered face. He spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that echoed clearly through the massive glass boardroom. He asked Preston if he genuinely believed that he would ever buy his oldest, most respected rival's entire construction company from a pathetic, scheming little rat without picking up the phone and calling him first. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute. Richard Maxwell's words hung in the cold air, completely shattering the illusion of Preston's grand heist. I watched as my son-in-law struggled to process the terrifying reality of the situation. His eyes darted frantically between Richard sitting calmly at the table and me standing firmly in the doorway. The arrogant, untouchable tech entrepreneur had vanished. In his place was a terrified, desperate child who finally understood that he had walked blindly into a meticulously designed trap. Preston looked down at the mahogany table, his gaze locking onto the thick stack of forged legal documents and the fraudulent medical affidavit he had presented just moments ago. He realized instantly that those papers were no longer his ticket to salvation. They were a signed, undeniable confession to multiple federal crimes. Survival instinct took over. Preston lunged forward across the table, his arms outstretched, desperately trying to snatch the documents back. He moved with a clumsy, panicked aggression, his fingers scraping wildly against the polished wood. He never even managed to touch the paper. Before Preston could pull the documents toward his chest, a tall, imposing figure stepped smoothly out from the shadows of the adjoining private executive suite. It was Garrett Nash. My private investigator had bypassed the front reception desk hours ago and had been waiting silently in the connected room the entire time. Garrett did not draw a weapon. He simply raised a high-definition digital recording camera, the small red light blinking steadily on the front of the device. He kept the lens focused squarely on Preston's pale, sweating face. Preston froze, his hands hovering uselessly over the table. He looked at the camera, then up at Garrett, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Garrett spoke with the calm, authoritative tone of a former federal agent. He informed Preston that every single word spoken in this boardroom, every gesture made, and every fraudulent document presented had been legally recorded in full compliance with corporate security protocols. Preston stumbled backward, his legs giving out completely. He collapsed heavily into the ergonomic leather chair, his body sinking into the expensive upholstery as the last remnants of his fake courage dissolved. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, my polished leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. I stopped at the edge of the table, looking down at the pathetic boy my daughter had chosen over her own father. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to yell to convey my absolute dominance over him. I kept my tone perfectly even, slicing through his panic with cold, surgical precision. I told Preston that he had made a series of catastrophic miscalculations. I explained that his first mistake was believing that I was a weak, easily manipulated old man. His second mistake was assuming that he could forge my thumbprint on asset transfer documents without triggering a massive automated legal review by my corporate attorneys. But his third and final mistake was by far the most fatal. It was a mistake born of sheer lazy arrogance and a fundamental misunderstanding of how real power operated in this city. I leaned forward, resting my knuckles on the cold mahogany table. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and dismantled his entire reality. I told him that he had spent the last 3 days desperately trying to sell my entire commercial construction empire to Vanguard Holdings. He had targeted Richard Maxwell because he believed Vanguard was a fiercely independent corporate conglomerate, a hungry predator eager to swallow up a rival company for pennies on the dollar. He had assumed that Richard's historical hatred for me would blind him to the fraudulent nature of the sale. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, forcing him to hang on my every word. Then I dropped the final crushing truth. I explained that Richard and I had indeed been bitter enemies in the 1990s. We had fought brutal wars over real estate and municipal contracts. But business is fundamentally fluid. 10 years ago, when Vanguard Holdings faced a severe, unpublicized liquidity crisis, Richard had needed an immediate massive influx of capital to avoid complete bankruptcy. I told Preston that I had quietly provided that capital. I had structured a highly classified, heavily buried holding company to execute the bailout. I told Preston that he had completely failed to do his homework. I revealed that I had been a silent 51% majority shareholder in Vanguard Holdings for an entire decade. Preston's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. He could not form a single coherent word. The blood rushed from his face as the sheer magnitude of his blunder crashed over him. I watched the realization shatter his mind. I leaned in closer and delivered the killing blow. I told him that he had not brought my stolen company to an independent buyer. I told him that he had just tried to sell my own construction empire directly to me. Preston suddenly physically broke down. He slumped forward in the chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. A loud, pathetic sob echoed through the quiet boardroom. He realized instantly that there was absolutely no escape from this room. He was trapped in a flawless, inescapable cage composed of his own boundless greed. I stood over him, outlining the exact severity of the situation. I listed his actions meticulously, speaking for the benefit of Garrett's rolling camera. I stated that he had just committed grand larceny, massive wire fraud, and corporate espionage. I noted that he had presented forged medical documents and falsified asset transfers across state lines. I reminded him that he had done all of this on a high-definition time-stamped recording in front of the chief executive officer of the acquiring company and a fully licensed private investigator. His crimes were no longer a family dispute. They were severe federal offenses that carried mandatory minimum sentences spanning decades. He had handed me the rope, tied the noose, and willingly slipped his own head inside. Preston continued to weep, his shoulders shaking violently under his cheap navy suit. The sophisticated tech entrepreneur was exposed as nothing more than a frightened, desperate criminal who had vastly overestimated his own intelligence. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the heavy atmosphere of the boardroom. It was the loud, aggressive ringtone of Preston's cell phone vibrating in his breast pocket. He flinched violently, patting his jacket with frantic, uncoordinated movements. He pulled the phone out and stared at the caller identification flashing on the screen. The sheer terror in his eyes somehow magnified tenfold. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, his lip quivering. He whimpered that it was his shadow creditors calling. He was completely out of time, and he was entirely out of money. He begged me to help him, pleading that they were going to kill him if he walked out of this building empty-handed. I did not offer him an ounce of sympathy. I stood up straight, adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit, and looked toward the thick glass doors of the boardroom. I gave a sharp, deliberate nod to the security guards waiting in the lobby. The heavy doors swung open one final time. A team of stern, heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, personally coordinated by my attorney, Bradley Lawson, marched briskly into the room. The swift, brutal efficiency of the federal agents left absolutely no room for negotiation. I stood silently and watched as steel cuffs were locked securely around Preston's wrists. His pathetic sobbing echoed through the glass walls, but it elicited zero sympathy from anyone present. Richard Maxwell offered a respectful nod as the agents escorted my ruined son-in-law toward the freight elevator. Bradley confirmed that Preston's electronic devices and portfolio had been seized as federal evidence. The Shadow Syndicate, holding his massive commercial debt, would no longer be his primary concern. He was headed to a maximum security facility where his political connections would mean absolutely nothing. I thanked Richard, and Bradley turned on my heel and walked out of the towering skyscraper. The afternoon sun dipped lower in the Chicago sky as I drove my vehicle out of the parking garage. The adrenaline that fueled me through the corporate ambush began to recede, replaced by a cold resolve. The financial threat against Thorne Construction had been completely neutralized. But the most painful, deeply personal battle still awaited me back at my private estate. I navigated the city streets with mechanical precision, my mind locked entirely on the woman who had chemically poisoned me. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of my property and parked my vehicle near the front steps. The grand house looked deceivingly peaceful from the outside, a beautiful fortress of stone and glass that completely masked the profound betrayal rotting within its walls. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the quiet foyer. I did not need to search the massive house to find her. I could hear the frantic, heavy sounds of drawers slamming and hangers scraping loudly against metal rods, coming directly from the master suite upstairs. I walked deliberately up the grand staircase, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I stood in the open doorway of the bedroom and observed the frantic chaos. Morgan had pulled 3 large, expensive designer suitcases onto the mattress. She was hastily grabbing handfuls of silk dresses, expensive jewelry, and premium leather shoes, throwing them carelessly into the luggage. Her phone rested on the nightstand, its screen glowing with a panicked warning text. Preston must have managed to send before the federal agents seized his communications. She spun around to grab another stack of clothing from the closet and suddenly froze when she saw me standing perfectly still in the doorway. For a fraction of a second, raw terror flashed in her eyes. But she had spent her entire life mastering the art of emotional manipulation. She immediately dropped the designer clothes onto the floor and collapsed dramatically onto her knees. She covered her face with her hands and began to wail hysterically, forcing loud, desperate sobs to tear from her throat. She crawled across the expensive carpet toward my legs, reaching out to grasp the fabric of my tailored trousers. She looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, playing the role of the ultimate terrified victim. She shrieked that Preston was a monster. She cried out that he had completely lost his mind, that he was drowning in dangerous shadow debt, and that he had viciously threatened her life if she did not comply with his horrific plans. She begged me to believe that she never actually wanted to slip the antipsychotic medication into my herbal tea. She swore on her mother's grave that Preston had forced her to do it, that holding her hostage in her own home. She pleaded with me to protect her, to hide her from the federal authorities, and to use my immense wealth to save her from the nightmare her husband had created. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. A day ago, her performance might have broken my heart. A day ago, the protective father in me would have lifted her off the floor, wiped away her tears, and promised to shield her from the entire world. But that father had died outside the Waldorf Astoria. I slowly reached into the inside breast pocket of my charcoal gray suit jacket. I pulled out a single folded piece of thick paper. I methodically unfolded it and held it down so that the crisp, black ink was perfectly visible to her. It was a certified offshore banking dossier that Garrett Nash had intercepted just 2 hours ago. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that completely cut through her frantic sobbing. I read the details of the financial document aloud. It outlined a massive, highly secure wire transfer of $500,000 routed directly from Preston's fraudulent commercial loan into a private, heavily encrypted account located in the Cayman Islands. I looked directly into her eyes and noted that the offshore account did not bear Preston's name. It was registered solely and exclusively under her maiden name. She had methodically siphoned a massive cut of the stolen money for herself, actively preparing to abandon her doomed husband and leave me permanently locked away in a psychiatric facility. The loud, dramatic wailing stopped with mechanical immediacy. The fake tears vanished from her eyes as if someone had flipped a switch inside her brain. Morgan slowly lowered her hands from her face and stared blankly at the offshore bank statement. She let go of my trousers and pushed herself backward, sitting heavily on the carpeted floor. The facade of the terrified, victimized daughter instantly evaporated, melting away to reveal the cold, calculating, and utterly remorseless monster she had truly become. She did not offer another pathetic excuse. She did not attempt to formulate a new lie to explain away the massive theft. She just stared at me, her chest heaving with silent, frustrated rage, because she finally realized that her absolute best manipulation tactics were completely useless against the undeniable documented truth. I folded the bank statement and placed it back into my jacket pocket. I looked around the room at the scattered designer clothes and the half-packed luxury suitcases. I did not yell at her. I did not raise my voice in anger or demand to know how she could betray her own flesh and blood. Shouting would imply that I still cared enough to be wounded by her actions. Instead, I delivered my judgment with the chilling, detached efficiency of a business transaction. I reminded her of the exact words she had spoken to me in the dimly lit service hallway of the hotel. I told her that she had looked me dead in the eye and said, "Dad, you are not invited, go away." I let those cruel words hang heavily in the tense air between us. I looked down at her and delivered my final permanent ruling. I stated clearly and firmly, "Well, Morgan, this is my house, you are not invited, go away." Her mouth dropped open in profound shock, but she was abruptly interrupted by blinding red and blue lights reflecting against the large bedroom windows. A tactical team of local police and federal agents rapidly swarmed the front perimeter of the property. 3 armed officers burst into the master bedroom, violently grabbing her arms and locking heavy steel handcuffs securely around her wrists. A stern agent read her Miranda rights, explicitly stating she was being arrested as an accessory to attempted murder by chemical poisoning and severe financial fraud. She screamed my name hysterically, but I simply turned my back and locked the heavy mahogany door. The heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse clicked shut behind me, sealing out the chaotic noise of the Chicago morning traffic. It was exactly 9 o'clock on Monday. This was the precise date and time Morgan had originally scheduled to legally strip away my humanity. She had planned to sit in this very courtroom wearing a designer dress and dabbing away fake tears, while a judge permanently declared me a mindless invalid. Instead, the reality of the room was a stark, poetic reversal of her sinister design. I walked down the center aisle wearing a pristine, tailored navy blue suit, my posture perfectly straight, my mind sharper than it had been in decades. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table beside Bradley Lawson. Across the room, sitting at the defense table, were my daughter and my son-in-law. They were not wearing high-end fashion. They were stripped of their elite armor, dressed in bright, humiliating Orange County jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that rattled loudly. Morgan looked completely hollowed out. Her face was pale, her hair was a tangled mess, and she kept her eyes glued to the scuffed floorboards. Preston was trembling uncontrollably, frantically, whispering to a team of highly expensive, incredibly stressed defense attorneys who looked like they were trying to bail out water from a rapidly sinking ship. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with a suffocating, undeniable tension. I sat back in my wooden chair and allowed myself a brief moment to absorb the profound shift in power. The predators who had planned to feast on my corporate carcass were now completely trapped in a cage of their own making. The presiding judge, an imposing man with silver hair and a notoriously strict reputation, struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block. He called the hearing to order, his stern gaze sweeping across the defense table before settling on me. He announced that this emergency session was originally docketed as a probate hearing for permanent medical guardianship. He noted the severe, unprecedented escalation of the case over the weekend, transitioning the matter from a civil family dispute into a massive federal criminal proceeding. He asked me to take the stand to provide my sworn testimony regarding the events that had transpired within my private estate. I stood up, buttoned my tailored suit jacket, and walked purposefully toward the witness box. I placed my right hand on the leather-bound book, swore to tell the absolute truth, and sat down. I looked directly at Morgan. She finally raised her head, meeting my gaze for a fraction of a second before shame and terror forced her to look away. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I spoke clearly, projecting my voice so that every word resonated against the high vaulted ceiling of the courtroom. I recounted the entire timeline with surgical precision. I detailed the fake tax optimization documents, the insidious manipulation of my daily routine, and the sudden unapproved commercial loan taken against my construction empire. I made sure to emphasize the absolute betrayal of trust, painting a vivid picture of their relentless greed. The defense attorneys immediately attempted to object, scrambling to their feet, to claim that my testimony was based on circumstantial misunderstandings. They tried to argue that Morgan and Preston were simply overwhelmed children attempting to care for an ailing parent. I did not let their pathetic defense gain a single inch of traction. I nodded to Bradley, who stood up and approached the judge's bench, holding a sealed, certified evidence folder. I announced that I possessed undeniable, scientific proof of their calculated malice. Bradley handed the judge an official toxicology and chemical analysis report. I explained to the silent courtroom that during the federal raid on my estate, agents had successfully seized a small, unmarked glass vial hidden in the back of the master kitchen refrigerator. The certified laboratory results confirmed that the vial contained a highly concentrated lethal dosage of liquid haloperidol. I explained exactly what the drug was, detailing how it was a powerful antipsychotic medication meant for severe schizophrenia. I told the judge that my daughter had been secretly slipping microdoses of this dangerous chemical into my nightly herbal tea for weeks, actively destroying my motor functions and inducing profound cognitive confusion. I stated that her ultimate plan was to administer a massive double dose on the morning of my evaluation to guarantee my failure. A horrified, stunned murmur rippled through the quiet courtroom gallery. Even the scrambling defense attorneys physically recoiled, staring at their own clients with visible disgust and absolute disbelief. Morgan began to sob loudly, shaking her head in a desperate, futile attempt to deny the irrefutable physical evidence sitting right in front of the judge. But I was not finished. The chemical report was merely the foundation of their destruction. I directed this court's attention to the large digital monitor that Bradley had set up near the jury box. I informed the judge that my private estate was equipped with a highly classified closed-circuit surveillance grid. Bradley pressed a button on his remote, and the high-definition video feed flared to life on the screen. The entire courtroom watched in absolute, stunned silence as the footage from my kitchen played out. They saw Morgan holding the exact glass vial of haloperidol. They heard her voice crisp and venomous, telling Preston that she would double the dose to ensure I would not even know my own name. They watched Preston grab her arm frantically, demanding that they steal my physical thumbprint while I was passed out from the drugs. The sheer calculated evil displayed on the screen was undeniable. There was no room for misinterpretation. There was no clever legal loophole that could erase the sight and sound of a daughter actively plotting to chemically lobotomize her own father for a financial payout. The judge stared at the screen, his face turning a deep, furious shade of red. He took off his reading glasses and looked down at the defense table with a gaze that could melt solid steel. Preston buried his pale face in his heavy chained hands, openly weeping in sheer terror. Before the judge could deliver his furious reprimand, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, authoritative crash. 2 armed federal marshals marched down the center aisle. Dragged roughly between them was Dr. Aris. His sleek, custom-tailored navy suit was completely rumpled, and his wrists were tightly bound in heavy steel handcuffs. The corrupt physician who had willingly signed away my freedom for a thick envelope of cash looked absolutely terrified. I was forced into a chair near the defense table. The judge struck his gavel with such violent force that the sound echoed like a gunshot. He did not ask for further arguments. He immediately struck down the fraudulent medical power of attorney, permanently nullifying their control over my life. He issued a sweeping, immediate order to freeze every single financial asset, offshore account, and property attached to Morgan and Preston. He declared them an extreme flight risk and a profound danger to society. He stated that their calculated cruelty demonstrated a shocking lack of basic human morality. Looking directly at the weeping, utterly broken couple in their bright orange jumpsuits, the judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down one final time, completely and permanently denying them bail. The echoing crack of the judge's wooden gavel signaled the end of Preston and Morgan's reign of terror, as federal marshals escorted my weeping daughter and her ruined husband. Out of the courtroom, I felt profound closure. The immediate legal threat to my legacy had been neutralized. Preston Gaines had attempted to dismantle my construction empire to cover his pathetic financial failures. He had used my name as a shield against the shadow syndicate. Authorities had successfully dismantled that criminal network based on our evidence. However, Preston still had a legitimate, albeit failing technology startup registered under his name. It was a hollow shell of a company drowning in corporate debt, abandoned by its investors. The moment his federal arrest broke across the financial networks, I directed my senior attorney, Bradley Lawson, to initiate aggressive bankruptcy proceedings against Preston's abandoned technology firm. The remaining board members were desperate to liquidate whatever useless assets remained to salvage pennies on the dollar. 2 weeks after the courtroom showdown, I walked into a sterile conference room in downtown Chicago to meet with the scrambling bankruptcy liquidators. They laid out the final dissolution contracts on a cheap folding table. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and respect, fully aware of how I had destroyed their former chief executive officer. I sat down and reviewed the inventory of his company. It included servers, proprietary software algorithms, and a lease on a downtown office space. I did not offer to assume any of their outstanding corporate liabilities. I reached into my tailored suit jacket, pulled out my wallet, and extracted a single crisp $1 bill. I placed the green paper precisely in the center of the table. I told the liquidators this was my absolute final offer for the entire acquisition of Preston's company. I explained that I was purchasing his intellectual property hardware and trademarks solely for the distinct pleasure of legally erasing them from existence. They accepted the single dollar bill. I signed the acquisition paperwork and immediately ordered my operations team to dismantle the servers, terminate the office lease, and dissolve the corporate entity. I erased Preston Gaines from the commercial registry. His arrogant ambition was permanently reduced to a single piece of paper sitting on a folding table, with the final loose ends completely severed. I drove back to my sprawling estate. I pulled through the wrought iron gates and parked in the circular driveway. I unlocked the mahogany front door and stepped into the grand foyer. For the first time in 6 months, I did not have to brace myself for the fake, suffocating smiles of my daughter or the arrogant remarks of her husband. The stone and glass fortress was empty. I walked slowly through the quiet corridors, letting the profound silence wash over my shoulders. I stepped into the kitchen where Morgan had coldly measured out lethal doses of antipsychotic medication. The space did not feel tainted by her betrayal. It felt remarkably purified. I walked down the hall and stood in the doorway of the guest bedroom, the cell they had prepared for my cognitive decline. I looked at the neatly made bed where I had lain perfectly still, listening to them plot my physical and financial destruction. I did not feel a single ounce of loneliness standing in the empty mansion. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound cleansing. The toxic burden I had been carrying since Carolyn passed away had finally been lifted. For years, I had desperately clung to the biological obligation of family, blindly convinced my bloodline inherently deserved my unconditional protection and endless financial resources. I had ignored the glaring red flags of Morgan's entitlement because I was afraid of growing old alone in this house. As I stood in the quiet sunlight filtering through the bedroom window, a hard, necessary realization settled permanently into my soul. I finally understood that sharing biological DNA does not automatically create a family. True family is built on a foundation of unwavering loyalty, mutual respect, and genuine compassion. Morgan and Preston possessed none of those qualities. They viewed my love as a pathetic weakness to be ruthlessly exploited for personal gain. They were not my family. They were a highly malignant tumor that had attached itself to my life's work. By severing them from my estate and sending them to federal prison, I had not destroyed my family. I had simply taken a surgical scalpel and cut out a deadly cancer before it could kill me. The peace of that realization was worth more than any amount of money. I walked out of the guest bedroom and headed toward my home office. I sat down in my leather desk chair and looked out the window at the manicured back gardens. The dark storm clouds that had plagued the city for weeks had finally cleared, leaving behind a brilliant cloudless blue sky. Just as I leaned back to enjoy the warm sunlight hitting my face, the sleek black telephone sitting on my mahogany desk began to ring. I checked the digital caller identification display. It was a direct line from the executive management offices of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. I picked up the receiver and answered with a calm, even tone. It was Valerie Sutton, the executive banquet manager, whom I had terrified on the night of the aborted wedding reception. She began to stammer a frantic apology, bracing herself for a massive lawsuit. She told me how incredibly sorry the hotel management team was for the chaotic disruption in the grand ballroom. She explained their accounting department was preparing to refund the remaining balance of the catering deposit. I had paid. I listened to her nervous voice, feeling a gentle smile form on my face. I stopped her mid-sentence. I told Valerie to relax. I was not going to pursue any legal action. She had executed my emergency instructions perfectly under extreme duress. I instructed her to cancel the refund. I ordered her to keep the entire $150,000 payment and distribute it as a tax-free cash bonus to the service staff, the security team, and the musicians who had their evening ruined by my daughter. Valerie gasped, her voice cracking as she tearfully thanked me. I hung up the phone and looked out the window. The money was completely irrelevant to me now. I had just used that wedding deposit to buy my absolute freedom. The storm was over and I was finally home. I stood up, walked away from the desk, and smiled quietly. In the cutthroat world of business, we are taught to trust nobody. Yet we foolishly leave our blind spots unguarded when it comes to family. Blood is not a shield against greed. Exactly 12 months have passed, since the heavy wooden doors of that federal courtroom closed on the darkest chapter of my entire existence. The passage of time is a remarkable healer, but the complete removal of a toxic element from your daily life is an absolute cure. I am currently sitting in the sunlit breakfast nook of my estate, sipping a cup of freshly brewed black coffee. My hands do not tremble in the slightest. My mind is razor-sharp, unclouded by the insidious chemical fog that had once been secretly administered to me under the guise of familial care. My health is absolutely immaculate. The comprehensive blood panels conducted by my new thoroughly vetted medical team have confirmed that not a single trace of the antipsychotic medication remains in my system. I reclaimed my physical autonomy the very moment the federal agents placed those steel handcuffs on my daughter. The justice system moved with a swift and brutal efficiency that surprised even my most seasoned corporate attorneys. Preston Gaines, stripped of his arrogant facade and drowning under the immense weight of his irrefutable recorded confessions, attempted to negotiate a leniency agreement by offering to expose his shadow syndicate creditors. The federal prosecutors accepted his information, but they did not grant him mercy for the corporate espionage and the attempted chemical incapacitation of an elderly citizen. He was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His pristine suits have been permanently replaced by standard-issue prison uniforms. Morgan realized very quickly that her fabricated tears held absolutely no sway over federal judges who had watched the high-definition footage of her measuring out my poison. Facing a mountain of incontrovertible forensic and digital evidence, she ultimately folded. She accepted a structured plea deal, securing an 8-year sentence in a state correctional facility. I made a conscious, unwavering decision the day the gavel struck the sounding block. I have not visited her. I have not sent a letter, nor have I accepted any of the collect calls she has attempted to place from the prison telephone system. The communications are automatically intercepted and blocked by my security protocol. Some of my old business associates quietly asked if I felt a lingering sense of paternal guilt for leaving my only biological child to languish behind bars. I always look them dead in the eye and tell them the absolute truth. I do not feel guilt. I feel a profound, unapologetic liberation. The woman serving that 8-year sentence is not the little girl I raised. She is a calculated predator who actively chose to prioritize her lavish, unsustainable lifestyle over her father's basic human right to exist. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it is not a mandatory requirement for survival. I chose my survival over her comfort. For years, I had desperately clung to the biological obligation of family, blindly convinced that my bloodline inherently deserved my unconditional protection and endless financial resources. I had ignored the glaring red flags of Morgan's entitlement because I was profoundly afraid of growing old alone in this massive house. But standing on the other side of that nightmare, I finally understand that isolation is infinitely preferable to being surrounded by smiling assassins. The sprawling stone and glass mansion I live in is undeniably vast, but it does not feel empty in the way it used to. It feels entirely cleansed. The suffocating tension that once clung to the hallway walls has completely dissipated. I no longer have to sleep with one eye open, wondering if the person bringing me a glass of water is quietly measuring out the exact dosage required to steal my mind. I am the sole master of my domain, surrounded only by staff and security professionals who are compensated for their work and respect the boundaries of our professional arrangement. With my personal life finally secured, I turned my vast energy back toward the commercial construction empire I had spent 4 decades building. I realized that my priorities had fundamentally shifted. I no longer harbored the burning desire to conquer every single municipal bidding war or acquire every available acre of prime Chicago real estate. My legacy could not simply be a collection of steel skyscrapers and massive concrete foundations. I needed to build something that would stand as a permanent fortress against the exact type of invisible domestic evil I had miraculously survived. I contacted Bradley Lawson and initiated a comprehensive corporate restructuring. I officially sold a significant 40% portion of Thorn Construction to a carefully vetted syndicate of private investors. The sale generated an immense wave of liquid capital, far exceeding the pathetic numbers Preston had attempted to negotiate with Vanguard Holdings. The transaction was seamless, finalized, without a single drop of the desperation that had fueled my son-in-law's criminal conspiracy. I took that massive influx of wealth and channeled it entirely into a new, highly personal venture. I officially opened the doors of the Carolyn Thorne Foundation, naming the institution in honor of my late wife, a woman who possessed a heart full of genuine compassion. The foundation is not a vanity project or a simple tax write-off. It is a fully funded, highly aggressive legal and medical advocacy firm dedicated exclusively to protecting elderly individuals who are suffering from family-perpetrated financial abuse and medical manipulation. I hired a team of elite former prosecutors, ruthless forensic accountants, and specialized medical evaluators. We actively seek out cases where vulnerable seniors are being systematically drained of their assets by entitled children and predatory relatives who view their parents merely as expiring bank accounts waiting to be looted. We step in completely free of charge and bring the absolute full weight of my corporate legal team crashing down upon the abusers. We reverse fraudulent power of attorney filings, freeze stolen bank accounts, and ensure that those who prey on the elderly are subjected to the harshest possible criminal penalties. The Foundation has already rescued over 40 individuals from circumstances nearly identical to my own. Every single time my legal team successfully strips an abusive child of their stolen authority, I feel a deep, resonant echo of justice. I took the darkest, most terrifying betrayal of my entire life and forged it into a weapon of mass protection. The wealth that Morgan so desperately tried to steal is now being utilized every single day to hunt down predators exactly like her. In the cutthroat world of business, we are taught to trust nobody. Yet we foolishly leave our blind spots unguarded when it comes to family. Blood is not a shield against greed. Sometimes it is the very weapon used by those closest to you to bleed you completely dry. I built an empire with my bare hands. But my greatest victory was surviving the predators sitting at my own dinner table. Never ignore your gut, never surrender your independence, and never let anyone convince you that your time is over. If you must burn bridges to protect your sanity, strike the match yourself and let the fire light your way forward. If this deeply personal story resonates with you, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your own experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life to protect your own sanity? Please let me know right down below in the section. I personally read every single one of your thoughtful comments.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every